It's going.
Okay, so I think it's time to get started at 4 o'clock. Last presentation of the day, I promise, and my last presentation, I truly promise. I'm done. All right, so welcome to today's presentation again on good stuff in PeopleSoft and ADFS really, and integration of those with CAS. Bryan and John are going to collaborate with me. Well, the better word is they're going to do the presentation. I'm going to try to stay quiet for the most part. What we're going to talk about really is we're going to cover how one would CASify or integrate PeopleSoft with CAS with very little workload, very little work and very minimal configuration. Bryan mostly and I will take that part up, and then John will also talk about how you would, if you have an ADFS server installed, how you would integrate that with your CAS server, and it would particularly this probably would be of importance to you if you are or have adopted Office 365 and you'd like to have CAS sort of be in the mix in the way that you want. So Bryan Wooten of Utah, everybody knows Bryan. He's been with Utah. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been with Utah about 10 years now. Used to work for Novell and some other companies in the past. Been doing mostly CAS and identity stuff for the past 3 or 4 years. And let's see, that's all about me. And you guys,
John and I, everybody knows John and I. Again, practitioners of Unicon, I am related, deal with CAS, Ship and Grouper, and part of the open source support program at Unicon.
Yep, so we're going to talk about how to CASify Oracle PeopleSoft. So the objective is to CASify a PeopleSoft web application via the Java CAS client by using the remote user as with the by populating it with the CAS principal ID. The main thing we have to do is write some Peoplecode to do that authentication, and then get remote user into PeopleSoft. And it really is easy. There are just 3 steps required. We're going to do the usual, put your CAS filters in your WebLogic web.xml. Now this is going to be totally unsupported by PeopleSoft. Just so you know, you're going to go into your binary running system and you're going to go tweak this unbeknownst to them. But it works really well. Then there's what's called sign-on Peoplecode, and it's called Funklib LDAP, and it's a Peoplecode app designer thing you go into and change. And then there's some PeopleSoft panels, as they call them, where you go configure your sign-on Peoplecode, so that you can actually take advantage of what you've done to Funklib. So step 1 is add the CAS filters to your web.xml. Now I will point out that in this case we're talking about the Peoplesoft Portal, but it could be any of the other content providers like financials or HR. And so the directories might be a little bit different, but they all work the same. Don't forget to put your CAS client in the class path so you don't get class not found errors. And you'll need to make sure your CAS server certificate is in the PeopleSoft key store for the back channel communication and not getting SSL handshake errors. And we've all seen this before. If you do CAS, it's your typical CAS filters. Get them in the correct order. I think in my example here, we pretty much protect all the URLs. And I think Lisa might mention something later about deep links in PeopleSoft and some of the issues there. Next step is to modify our sign-on Peoplecode. We're going to add a method called CAS Authentication, and that's where some magic will happen. And I think these are Lisa's notes here about the web profile and making sure that we get this set up correctly.
So the idea is, in order for the Peoplecode to execute, and this is something that you'll likely run into issues. In Bryan's 3-step program, you're very likely to run into this particular issue where the Peoplecode that, as part of that CAS authentication function, you write will not be executed by PeopleSoft. No matter what you do, it just won't get invoked. And that can be a very confusing problem. So this is what you really need to consider in order to get that piece of code working. Once you do that, then you're really golden safe. So what you need to do is PeopleSoft has this concept of web profiles. They're effectively tiers within the profile environment, right? They're just, as exactly as I say, they're just profiles about a certain set of configuration you do within the application, within the portal. So, and it was explained to me that everything in PeopleSoft, regardless of whether you're authenticated or not, has a context. There is an authenticated context associated with it. Whether you've logged in or not, there is a context. So you need to set up a guest context, right? A default guest context needs to be created in the profile. It needs to be set up in a way that it has correct permissions to execute that particular piece of Peoplecode that you wrote, right? So you need to make sure it has the right permissions. And it most definitely, if you're familiar with PeopleSoft, it should allow public access. There's a checkbox that says allow public users, and that needs to be checked. So that's the guest profile. Like I mentioned, again, you'll need to make sure that there are valid roles and permissions configured for this particular profile to execute that piece of Peoplecode. That's very important. And when you figure out how to create a profile, and when you figure out how to make it accept everybody and publicly, you will deploy it and nothing will change and nothing will work. And the reason for that is, and again I learned this recently, that there is a file called configuration.properties in the profile, in the PeopleSoft environment, that it is not accessible in the UI. You will need to physically go to that file and make sure that the changes you created and the profile that you put together is the active one. Because by default, it very well may not be. By default, the activation of the profile is controlled by that external file. There is no checkbox or button in the UI that says, activate the changes that I just made. So go there, make sure that the profile is active, and then restart or whatever you need to do, and that way you can get the Peoplecode executed in the profile.
Cool. And so this is the full method we added to what's called funclib LDAP to do CAS authentication. And so it'll be kind of like the CAS stuff. There's a flow of things, and so this method will get invoked. And really, all the magic is there in red. It basically says, if remote user set, somebody must have done it, and I trust them. It must have been CAS. And so in this case, we get the CAS result, which will be our user ID. And then to make PeopleSoft think the person's logged in is that simple call to set authentication result. And I'm not sure what true, upper, false, all that means. Your PeopleSoft people will know what that is. But that will work. So it's just, you could probably leave off all the other stuff and just have those 2 lines and it would work, except in the null case. And like I said, this is the complete method, so feel free to steal it. I will only say that the logger.info stuff is probably another piece of custom written code that we wrote, so that probably won't work. You have to use some other kind of logging method. And then the third step, which kind of corresponds with what Misagh was talking about earlier, is we make sure we hit the right checkboxes, and we say that right there on the right-hand side to the top, make sure you call CAS authentication. And then so it's going to do all those things on the right-hand side, and get those boxes checked, and you're good to go. You will now suddenly try to restart your servers, hit your Peoplesoft portal, and you will be logged in. I should point out that we really covered it in this these slides, but there's a way, and I somehow lost the details of that you still allow for a backdoor entry in case your CAS server is down, so you can get to PeopleSoft. Because there might be a case where PeopleSoft is really your mission-critical application, and your CAS server is down, you really need to get into it. And so there is a way. We did some magic URL stuff to do that, to say, okay, just skip the the fun clipping, just go right to a PeopleSoft login page. But and I'll need to look that up again and maybe add it to this for future reference. And then the last part we all care about, especially PeopleSoft people, is sign out. Now in our case, CAS has a timeout of 10 hours. We believe in 4-day work weeks for people. Sign in once all day, we give them 10 hours. The people that run PeopleSoft are like, oh, no, you get 45 minutes and we're going to log you out. And somehow, magically, when PeopleSoft decides to kick you out and you try to get back in, you do have to, in fact, log in through CAS. So somehow they've managed to make sure that they've ignored, or they might be using renew equals true. Also might be the other option we've got going on there. But in addition, you have sign out buttons in PeopleSoft, and so you might want to go out and modify this sign out HTML page. And as an example, I gave a URL, and I basically said, you know, do a redirect over here to our CAS logout page, and redirect back to PeopleSoft. This is something I can't guarantee this works. It seems to work, but I really can't prove that it works because we got a clustered environment, and I'm not sure if it's only because I'm sticky and I always go back to the same place, and browsers behave differently. So this seems to work, but single sign-out's always a problem, and I just don't. Use at your own risk is all I can say. Inform your users. And I think Misagh had some additional tips and suggestions that he
So how would I best put this? So 20% of the work takes 80% of your time, right? And I think this slide will help with that 80% because most of your time in doing this and following those steps will be spent on troubleshooting. So I thought I'd give some suggestions on what to do. You want to make sure that that CAS Authentication Peoplecode function, as was shown in Bryan's example, is logging stuff to somewhere. You want to know what's happening inside that piece of code. There is documentation describes what you can do to debug the code. I don't recommend you doing it because then 20% of work takes 100% of your time. Again, it can get very, very, very confusing, especially if you don't know PeopleSoft's Peopletools and code. So just make sure that you're logging data to somewhere. Now the CMD equals start is really, really fun. We were working on, Unicon was working with a client trying to CASify PeopleSoft, and we did everything according to the 3-step program. And everything was working fantastically fine. I was working on the project, made sure everything works, I handed it off to them, you go ahead and test it. They tried it, they said everything works, they started to apply the same instructions into a new environment, just to see if they can actually redo everything that we've done in dev. They do everything, and it never works. So when we start troubleshooting, we realize that if you specify in the initial URL that you hit to try to go into PeopleSoft so that you get redirected to CAS and come back, if your initial URL starts with CMD equals login, PeopleSoft will always show you its own login page. And so the URL that that particular client was using to test CAS authentication with had CMD equals login. So if you change that to CMD equals start, then things just start to work. And that's not an easy thing to spot because you don't pay attention to the URL. Just say I want to go to PeopleSoft, but you need to make sure that particular URL is formatted correctly and that has that token in there. And the other thing is when you set up the web profile for the guest account access and public use, you want to make sure that again the Peoplecode single sign-on code is configured to be invoked as the user who has enough permissions to do this. And the way you can verify is if you log in with that user or role that has all the permissions, if you log in with that account directly into PeopleSoft, you'll get an error message that says, sorry, you're a guest, and you're not allowed to see anything. And that way you know you set up the profile correctly, and you can kind of cross that off your list of things that might go wrong in terms of troubleshooting. And remember that when in doubt, always restart. That always helps. Control, delete, reformat, but make sure that you're certain your changes are effective. And that's not always easy to recognize. Okay, last thing to talk about PeopleSoft. Now, once you get all this, then there will be requirements of what we want to do deep linking. And what do we mean by deep linking? If I use a link that would get me to PeopleSoft's 3rd tab, 4th screen, and if I want to go there and then I get redirected to CAS, if I log in, I want to go back to that same exact spot. The way that the presentation is sort of organized and the way that you configure your CAS clients, deep linking is enabled. Right? You can the CAS client will take the requested URL, whatever that happens to be, and PeopleSoft, fortunately, is smart enough to put you back in the same spot that was originally requested. So with this particular method, you do get deep linking support, but there is a caveat that if the URL somehow by PeopleSoft has a CMD equals login in it, everything breaks. Right? Regardless of what happens, PeopleSoft treats that as a login request, and that will show you the PeopleSoft's login page. You will never see that. So you want to make sure that you're never ever using that link anywhere in your code or your app or your portal or anywhere inside PeopleSoft. That's just not there. And we've thought about kind of augmenting the CAS client to just strip that parameter everywhere as it sees it. Just tick it off because it's going to cause all kinds of problems. The other thing you want to mention, it may not be a concern, but it certainly has come up, and that is that in this particular example, we're assuming that whatever you log into CAS with as your user ID is able to log into PeopleSoft. The accounts match, right? Because PeopleSoft has its own structure of where users come from, so accounts match. But if you've got a system where accounts don't match, but what you log into CAS with usually in the way you're identified to CAS is not the same account of PeopleSoft, you've got to be able to do some mapping. And whether you do that at the CAS server or PeopleSoft and Peoplecode, I leave that to your judgment. Do the CAS way. But it's something nonetheless to be concerned about. And then obviously, as Bryan mentioned, single sign-out is really just mileage. Your mileage will vary, so use at your own risk. I want to mention one last thing before I hand off to John, and that is we're really grateful. This is really Tom's baby, Tom's invention. Brigham Young University, who really came up with the idea. There are a lot of ways you can do this wrong and very, very complicated. And some of those ways are documented on the JC Wiki, unfortunately. So, and Tom looked at it, and I'm just kind of speaking through him. He looked at it and said, well, we're never going to get this to work, and we just don't want to do this. We don't understand it, and the instructions are not easy to follow, unless you really know PeopleSoft. So he really came up with the idea of we're going to treat PeopleSoft as just another web application. It's just another Java web app, and we're going to do it this way. And so we're really thankful to his instructions at BYU for providing that to us. And he was fortunate enough just before the presentation to tell me that there is a really strange bug where PeopleSoft, when it's integrated with CAS, can spin into endless loops that will bring down the PeopleSoft system. And it has something to do with iframes, the way the request is formed. If you've got a portal that has an iframe on it that wants to display a particular page deep into PeopleSoft, and PeopleSoft is integrated with CAS, you can effectively bring down PeopleSoft. So just be aware of those issues if you're thinking about integrating PeopleSoft and CAS. And again, thank you, Tom, for everything. Okay, up John. Next John is going to talk about CAS and ADFS.
Thanks, Misagh. Is anybody out here an Office 365 user? We're
going there.
You're going there.
I mean,
okay.
Actually, our students are there already. We just don't have them necessarily.
Okay, great. Just wanted to see if I was doing the video just to live on into perpetuity on YouTube, or if this would be applicable to somebody. So I'm John Gasper. I've been with Unicon now. Actually, it'll be 6 months in 3 or 4 days. This work that I did integrating CAS with Microsoft ADFS actually started at my work with Eastern Washington University. We were a Live at EDU school that converted, one of the first schools to convert to Office 365. It was for students, and then we brought the employees over. And at the time, in order to federate, we had to have Active Directory Federation services. There was no other way to do it. And so my work there, it started there, and then Unicon has been gracious enough to allow me to continue to work on this integration. And so we can talk about that. So Microsoft ADFS is yet another SSO environment. Unfortunately, as soon as you introduce ADFS, kind of like introducing Shibboleth, you've got two different competing SSO environments, and the goal was really to bring them together and to get them to, at least for the end users, to have a single experience for SSO. Why would you use ADFS? Well, Office 365, if you've gone that way, or if you're a Microsoft shop and you write a lot of custom apps in ASP.NET, there's the Windows Identity Foundation. The claim support in that integrates very well with ADFS for single sign-on. So in my trials and trying to get these two products to work together, I have come up with basically two ways that I know work to integrate, and a third that conceptually works, but I haven't had a chance to actually prove and to see if it works. So the first is CAS as a relying party within ADFS. So in theory, we're going to front CAS with ADFS. Users are going to authenticate through the ADFS login page. The second one is we're going to flip that. We're going to CASify ADFS. So instead of seeing the ADFS login screen, we would see the CAS login screen. And then the theoretical one was Active Directory as a service provider. And essentially, it would be using CAS's limited SAML2 support in order to authenticate. Again, in this case, CAS would be the primary authentication source, and it would create the SAML2 token that was passed ADFS to authenticate the user, just like you had done a federation with another IDP somewhere else. So in this, the first scenario, fronting CAS with ADFS, this would be the default login page. And essentially, this is the flow. A web application, a user hits a web application, they browse to, or they're redirected to the CAS login page with the service tag, this is normal CAS stuff. CAS Server would then do another redirect, passing the user down to ADFS. We authenticate ADFS. A post is made to the CAS login page containing the WS Federation token that is generated, which is really, in theory, a SAML 1.1 payload. And then that gets passed back to CAS Server. It evaluates it, checks the signature on the token to make sure it really did come from ADFS, that there wasn't some front channel hijinks going on with the user. At that point, CAS Server treats the user just like they authenticated through any of the currently supported authentication handlers. Username and password, through LDAP, JDBC, or X509 or Spinego. At that point, the ticket is generated and they're passed back to the web application. To do this, we use a module that I started with EWU and have since basically rewritten with some helps from several users on GitHub. And I don't expect the Eastern Washington University version probably to get much love moving forward, but the Unicom one should move forward and we'll hopefully go to 4.0. And to do that, well, I have Snapshot because it hadn't publicly been released to Maven Central yet. But you include this in your POM for CAS. At this point, you remove the hyphen snapshot, and it's going to pull in. And at that point, you've got the library necessary to make this happen. We need to include some configuration. So the easiest way I found to do that is to take, instead of going through all the different CAS configuration files and making little changes here and there, is just drop a new file into the Spring config WS Federation XML. The file name can be anything you want. And essentially, we define a bean, WS Fed config, and then we set some values. The first property is the identity provider identifier, and this is essentially the entity ID. For those of you familiar with Shibboleth, this is just the entity ID of the IDP. That is basically what the standard kind of ID that ADFS uses. You have to swap out your CAS server's name for the server name. The identity provider URL is where CAS is going to redirect the user to actually do the front channel authentication or the passive authentication with ADFS. Moving down, the identity attribute. In this case, we're using UPN. It could be SAM account name. It could be some other claim that's returned by ADFS. But CAS just gets back a bunch of attributes, and we need to tell it which one to utilize. The relying party identifier, we're using URN Federation CAS with colons in between for this example, but it could be pretty much anything you want as long as it's URI legit. This is what gets set up in ADFS as the identifier, and essentially this would be the equivalent of the Shibboleth service provider entity ID. Because we are talking about SAML and issue instance and related date times and milliseconds getting involved, we do have a tolerance because servers do drift. We had an issue at one point at EW where this had gone live, was working great for about a day, and then I think we vMotioned one of our, I don't remember if it was our CAS server or ADFS server, and authentication just broke. Well, it turned out in some cases that the token that had been generated by ADFS arrived at CAS before it was technically, it was in the future, and so that was fun to track down. And so we introduced a tolerance. This is very much like the SAML CAS client when you set the tolerance there. The attribute mutator is simply a bean. As the claims come in, perhaps you want to do some messing with them. We actually take the UPN, and if it's an Eastern domain, then we strip it so that it's just simply the username that's coming across. But if we had federated with a sister school or anyone else, we would want to know the domain as that was getting passed into CAS so we didn't have any collisions. So we'll see an example of how that works in a moment. But it also gives us a chance to remap claims that are coming from ADFS into attributes that CAS is, in our case, was already familiar with and all of our clients were expecting. The last attribute is the signing certificate files. As I said before, that token is cryptographically signed by ADFS, and in theory, the user could tamper with the payload as it comes across through their browser. And so we need a way to validate, and we're able to specify a location of one or more signing certificates. This is, so I didn't include a screenshot of the deployer config context. Adding in the plugin is basically like everything else. It's documented in the wiki, plus I have a real-world CAS server build that you can actually just lift, build, and would run with all of this, so you can go look at that for the details on that, because there's nothing really special about it. The login webflow XML, we do have to make a couple of changes. The biggest one is that at the beginning of it, we insert this chunk of XML that basically checks to see if the callback to /CAS/login actually has a SAML payload. If it does, or the WS Federation payload, if it does, we intercept it and then we skip the login page stuff. So on the ADFS side, configuring CAS as a relying party, it's pretty simple. There's a couple of things we do. The first thing we it looks like I got one of these pictures out of order. But the first thing we do is we create this relying party. We give it a name, doesn't matter what it is. It could be anything you want it to. The Federation service name that we use, adfsexample.org. Oh, actually, I got it. I'm sorry, let me back up real quick. So this is the ADFS server properties image, and that is where, let's see if I can, well, the lower one, that's what you're going to copy and paste into your CAS configuration. And then the right screenshot is where you would get the ADFS signing certificate. So you double click on it, export, and then copy that to your CAS server in the location that you'd specified back here down at the bottom. So this is us now configuring the relying party. We give the relying party a name, CAS Server. We put in the identifier. That's what we specify in the XML file. And then for the property, we have to add an endpoint. And so essentially, that's just our login page for CAS Server that we add. And that is it. At this point, the two servers trust each other. If we want to issue claims, and we need at least one so we know who the user is, we specify that on the claims add rule dialog. And so in this case, we've got some example claims that are coming across. And then if you happen to be, want to verify and you happen to know claims language, you can click the view rule language, and that's what's really actually executing in the background when this runs. This is the attribute mutator. So most of the important code, looks like some of it didn't make it onto the slide, or it got wrapped and off or something. But besides that first line of code, the rest of it, it's all about the same. I just have a function that does, basically deletes an attribute, adds a new one with a new name. So we swap. The CAS server was configured initially with attributes name, last name, first name, groups. In that case, it was pluralized, but where it comes from ADFS, it's surname, given name, employee number, and so we were able to do some magic to make that happen. If for some reason you don't need to mutate anything, you can just set that property back in the WSFed config XML. You just set that to null, or just leave that whole property off. The next method is so if we want to CASify ADFS. This really isn't more difficult than doing any other .NET app, except we do need to invoke ClearPass. So the steps basically are drop in the .NET CAS client DLL. The DLL is available on NuGet for those .NET developers out there. We're going to configure the web.xml for the ADFS web application, just like we would any other .NET app. And then we have to add a little bit of code to the form signin.aspx C# page. And it's kind of busy, but basically all crammed down onto one slide is we're retrieving the username that the CAS client has already made available for us. We need to get a proxy ticket. So this is fairly standard code, and we're just passing in the ClearPass URL there. We make a request to ClearPass, and then we get the password from there. And really the key to this, because ADFS, the forms authentication has to have the username and password to actually trigger the authentication, we're able to supply both of those to the sign-in method that makes that work. If you are using the CAS server on Windows Server 2012 R2, they basically took the web application that usually lived and ran through IS that you could find easily and manipulate. They took all of the source code and chunked it into a DLL. It's not compiled, it just simply is in there as a resource. So using Visual Studio, you can open that file, you can grab the C# file and make those modifications, put it back in, and then deploy that back to the server. I'm going to just state Microsoft will probably not support that. So if you do that, just beware you're on your own, which is why at AWU we chose to go the first route that I showed you, which was to front ADF or CAS with ADFS. The final method that I just kind of mentioned, that's a kind of a conceptual thing, which I would love to prove out, is that we can use that Google Apps Sample2 support to connect as a peer to ADFS. The nice bonus about this is that there's no significant mods needed for ADFS. You wouldn't have to add any additional modules to CAS. And at some point, I would love to prove it. So if you're interested in going that method, just let me know. And this would actually put CAS, though, in front of ADFS. Don't know if I made that clear before. If you're interested in that project, it's up on GitHub at Unicon, or the Unicon GitHub, and the CAS ADFS integration project is where you'll find that. Like I said, there is a working copy of CAS out there. It's bare bones, so the only changes to CAS Server that you'll see in that directory is stuff that was needed in order to get it running. So that's all I have. Any questions for myself or Bryan or Misagh? All right, let's go have some sodas or drinks or something else. Thanks, everybody.
So, John, I do have a question.
Okay.